They called her the Shattered Princess, though she was no longer a princess and her title had been stripped along with her dignity. Lady Ilara of House Valerus had once been the jewel of the court, her laughter a melody that echoed through the stone halls, her grace on horseback the subject of a dozen ballads. Now, she was only a memory of that girl, a living ghost confined to a wheeled chair her brother had grudgingly commissioned. An ill-fated jump, a spirited stallion, a fall that had stolen the life from her legs, that was all it had taken to transform her from an asset into a burden. Her worth, she had learned with brutal finality, had resided not in her mind or her spirit, but in the strength of her limbs and her value on the marital market. Both were now gone, and with them, all semblance of love from her family. Her brother, Prince Valerus, ruled now. He was a man carved from ambition and ice, his heart a cold, hard stone in his chest. He saw Ilara not as his sister, but as a stain upon the pristine image of power he wished to project. She was a constant, visible reminder of imperfection, a drain on the treasury, a whisper of weakness in the court. His cruelty was not born of passion but of calculation. He had allowed her to languish in a forgotten wing of the castle, the tapestries fading on the walls, the dust gathering like a shroud. But even this was not enough. He needed to excise her completely, and he would do it in a way that would be remembered not as cruelty, but as a bizarre and potent display of his absolute authority. The day of her final humiliation arrived with a sky the color of slate. Valerus had her brought to the great square, a place of celebration and execution, and she saw with dawning horror that the two were not so different. The townsfolk were gathered, their faces a mixture of confusion, pity, and morbid curiosity. Valerus stood on a platform, his voice booming with false magnanimity. He spoke of a hard winter to come, of the need for supplies, for cured meats and barrels of ale to fortify the castle. Then, his gaze fell upon her, and a chilling smile touched his lips. He declared that he would make a trade, a demonstration of his commitment to the people. He gestured to her, a broken doll in her polished wooden chair. A prince's sister, he announced, his voice ringing with contempt, for a prince's comfort. I offer this burden to any who will take her from my sight. Her price? 10 casks of your strongest ale and a cart of winter grain for the royal stores. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. It was not a sale, it was an act of profound defilement, a public declaration that she was worth less than winter provisions. She felt the world dissolve into a blur of shame, the faces of the crowd twisting into monstrous masks. This was not merely an exile. It was the complete and utter annihilation of her soul. In the crowd stood a man named Cale. He was a woodcutter, his hands calloused from the axe, his shoulders broad from hauling timber. His face was a landscape of quiet grief, etched with lines of a sorrow that never fully slept. He had lost his wife to a fever 2 winters past, and her absence was a constant, silent presence in his small cottage at the edge of the woods. It was in the empty space beside him in bed, in the uneaten portion of bread on the table, and most of all, in the profound silence of his daughter, Lyra. The child, only 6 years old, had not spoken a word since the day her mother's warmth had turned to cold stone. Cale's world had been reduced to the rhythmic chop of his axe and the hollow ache in his heart. He had come to the square to trade a cord of seasoned oak, his focus solely on securing enough flour and salt to last until the spring thaw. He watched the prince's grotesque spectacle with a slow-burning anger. He saw not the shattered princess the crowd whispered about, but a woman held captive by her own kin, her spirit being systematically dismantled before their eyes. He saw the tremor in her hands, the proud, rigid set of her jaw as she fought against the tears of shame. He looked at the leering faces of the merchants calculating the value of the trade, and something inside him, a deep well of decency that his own loss had not managed to poison, rose up. He could not stand by and witness this. Leaving his own cart of wood, he pushed through the murmuring throng until he stood at the foot of the platform. I will take her, he said, his voice low but clear, cutting through the prince's theatrical pronouncements. Valerus looked down, amused. And you have the 10 casks of ale, Woodcutter? Cale shook his head. No, your grace. I have no ale. But I have a full cart of the finest, driest oak in the valley. It will keep your fires burning hotter and longer than any other. Take it. It is all I have. and I will take the lady into my care. It was not the bargain the prince had wanted, but the public pressure was immense. To refuse now would be to admit his offer was pure cruelty. With a sneer, Valeroux agreed. The deal was struck. Ilara, a woman raised on silk and silver, was traded for a cartload of firewood. The journey from the cold grandeur of the castle to the woodcutter's home was a passage between worlds. Cale lifted her from her chair and carried her to his humble cart, his movements surprisingly gentle, his arms a cradle of unexpected strength. She buried her face in the rough wool of his tunic, hiding from the staring eyes, the scent of pine and earth and honest sweat filling her senses. It was a smell so alien from the cloying perfumes and sterile stone of her former life. They left the town behind, the ruts of the muddy track jostling her, every bump a reminder of her descent. When they arrived, she saw not a hovel, but a small, sturdy cottage built of dark timber, smoke curling from its stone chimney like a welcoming breath. Inside, the world changed again. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, of baking bread, and of drying herbs. A fire crackled in a large stone hearth, casting a warm, dancing light that made the simple wooden furniture glow. It was small, it was rustic, but it was alive with a warmth her gilded cage had never known. The sensory shock was overwhelming, a stark and sudden contrast that left her breathless. Cale carried her inside as if she were made of glass, placing her not on a stool in a corner, but in the most comfortable chair in the cottage, set close to the hearth's life-giving heat. He disappeared for a moment, returning with a heavy fur blanket which he draped carefully over her legs, the soft pelt a whisper of comfort against her skin. He did not speak much, his words as sparse and functional as his home, but his actions spoke a language she had forgotten existed, the language of simple, unbidden kindness. She had expected coarseness, perhaps resentment, or at best, a cold indifference. She was, after all, another mouth to feed, a useless body he had acquired in a moment of reckless pity. But there was no contempt in his eyes, only a quiet solemnity. He brought her a wooden bowl of thick, hearty stew, the steam rising to warm her face. As she ate, her hands trembling slightly, she saw the little girl, Lyra, peering at her from the shadows of a doorway, her eyes wide and dark, her expression unreadable. The child was a silent pixie, a creature of the forest as quiet as the snow. Later that evening, as the fire settled into a bed of glowing embers, Cale finally explained. He sat on a low stool across from her, his large hands resting on his knees. I saw what the prince was doing, he said, his voice a low rumble. It was wrong. No person should be treated as chattel. She looked at him, searching for the true reason, for the hidden angle. There was always a hidden angle. But why, she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. Why take on such a burden? He looked towards the doorway where his daughter had been, a profound sadness softening the rugged lines of his face. My daughter, Lyra, she has not spoken since her mother died. The healers say there is no ailment of the throat. The wound is in her mind. They say she needs something new. A voice that is not mine. A presence that is not heavy with grief. He looked back at Ilara, and for the first time, she saw the true nature of the transaction. You are highborn. You are educated. You can read. The village has no teacher. I did not see a burden, my lady. I saw a mind that could perhaps reach my daughter where I cannot. It was a revelation that struck her with the force of a physical blow. He had not taken her out of pity for her broken body, but out of respect for her unbroken mind. He was not giving her charity, he was offering her a purpose. The next day, he brought out a small collection of worn books, tales of ancient heroes, almanacs of the stars, a book of simple fables. Ilara's world, which had shrunk to the four walls of her room, suddenly expanded. She began to read to Lyra. At first, the child only listened from a distance, a fleeting shadow. But Ilara's voice, trained in the arts of recitation and poetry, was a gentle lure. Day by day, Lyra crept closer, her dark eyes fixed on Ilara's face, listening to stories of dragons and queens, of clever foxes and brave knights. Ilara taught her the shapes of letters, drawing them with a piece of charcoal on a smooth slate Cale had prepared. For the first time since her fall, Ilara felt a flicker of her old self. she was not a shattered princess or a piece of discarded property. She was a teacher. She was needed. And in the quiet, attentive gaze of a silent child, she began to find the first few scattered pieces of her own dignity. As the days shortened and the first snows began to dust the forest, a fragile trust bloomed in the warmth of the cottage. The quiet domestic rhythm became a silent conversation. One evening, as she watched Cale methodically sharpening the blade of his axe, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel a strangely comforting sound, she found the courage to speak of her own past. She told him about the girl she used to be, the one who lived for the thunder of hooves and the wind in her hair. She spoke of the accident not with self-pity, but with a kind of detached sorrow, as if describing the fate of a distant friend. She confessed her deepest fear, not the paralysis itself, but the way it had rendered her invisible to those who claimed to love her. Cale listened without interruption, his hand stilled, his gaze fixed on the fire. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the space between them, thick with unspoken understanding. Then, he spoke of his own wound. He described his wife, Elspeth, not as a saintly memory but as a vibrant, living woman, her laughter, the way she hummed while she baked, the fierce love she had for their daughter. He spoke of the fever that had come like a thief in the night, swift and merciless, and the crushing helplessness of watching the light fade from her eyes. He confessed his own failure, the guilt that haunted him for not being able to save her, a guilt that he feared had stolen his daughter's voice. In that shared space of vulnerability, a powerful bridge formed between them. They were two broken halves of a whole, each marked by a profound loss, one of the body, one of the soul. Their griefs were different, yet they rhymed, creating a bond of empathy that went deeper than words. That bond was tested and forged in the heart of a blizzard. The storm descended upon the forest without warning, a raging beast of wind and snow that howled like a legion of ghosts. It sealed them inside the cottage, the world outside erased by a swirling wall of white. For 3 days they were captives. The wind rattled the shutters and moaned in the chimney, and the cold began to seep through the timber walls. On the 3rd night, their supply of firewood in the cottage ran low, and the great fire that was the heart of their home dwindled to a sullen, hungry glow. The chill became a physical presence, sharp and biting. Lyra, wrapped in every blanket they had, shivered in her sleep. Cale, his face grim, looked at Ilara, who sat huddled in her chair, her own body growing numb with cold. Without a word, he rose, took the heaviest fur pelt, the one reserved for his own bed, and gently laid it over her, tucking it in around her shoulders. As he did so, his large, rough hand brushed against her neck, and lingered there for a heartbeat longer than necessary. It was not a lover's caress, but a touch of profound, protective intimacy. In that moment, the air between them grew thick, charged with an unspoken current. The howl of the wind outside was deafened by the sudden, roaring silence within. The world shrank to that single point of contact, his warmth against her cold skin, a silent promise of shelter in the heart of the storm. When the storm broke, it left behind a world of pristine, suffocating silence. But the peace was short-lived. The outside world, with its cruel judgments, began to intrude. Rumors spread through the village like a contagion. The woodcutter who harbored the prince's cast off. Some whispered Cale was bewitched, others that he was a fool inviting the wrath of the prince. His business, once steady, dwindled to nothing. Villagers who had once greeted him with a friendly nod now averted their eyes, afraid to be associated with him. The isolation became a siege, their small cottage an island in a sea of suspicion and fear. Their stores of food, already meager, began to shrink at an alarming rate. The true assault came not from the villagers, but from the castle. One afternoon, the prince's steward, a man with a ferret's face and a soul to match, appeared at their door. He did not dismount from his horse, looking down at Cale with undisguised contempt. The prince, he announced, his voice slick with malice, has decided to levy a tax. For the housing and feeding of royal property he named a sum so exorbitant it would have meant utter ruin. Cale's face went pale, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. But before he could speak, Ilara's voice, clear and cold as winter ice, cut through the air from the cottage doorway. "By what law do you levy this tax?" she demanded. The steward sneered. By the prince's decree. Ilara's expression was regal, her old authority returning to her like a forgotten mantle. The prince's decree does not supersede the king's charter. Article 7 of the Elder Laws states that any individual taken into wardship by a commoner, through public proclamation or sanctioned trade, becomes the full responsibility of that ward, with no further claim or tax due to their former house. You are attempting to tax a man for property you publicly relinquished. Your claim is baseless. Leave. The steward, stunned by this sharp, articulate rebuke from the broken a woman, stammered, his legal footing completely swept away. He wheeled his horse around and fled, his retreat far less dignified than his arrival. It was a victory, but a hollow one. The steward's retreat only fueled the prince's anger. The unofficial embargo on Cale's work became an official one. No one would buy his wood, no one would trade with him. As winter deepened its grip, true desperation set in. Their flour bin was nearly empty, the last of the salted meat gone. The cold was their constant companion, and hunger became a dull ache in their bellies. One night, huddled together by a pitifully small fire, the reality of their situation crashed down upon them. They were trapped, starving, with no hope of rescue. Lyra slept fitfully, her small face pinched with hunger. Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, tears of rage and helplessness. Cale reached out, his hand covering hers. "I am sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I brought this upon you." She shook her head fiercely, her fingers lacing with his. "No," she whispered back. "You brought me back to life." In that moment of shared despair, with nothing left but each other, the truth that had been growing between them finally broke free. "I love you," he breathed, the words a raw, painful confession in the quiet room. "And I love you," she answered, her voice choked but certain. Their love was not a thing of gentle courtship and sweet promises. It was forged in humiliation, tempered by hardship, and confessed in the face of ruin. It was their last and only defense, their ultimate act of rebellion. In the darkest hours before dawn, clinging to the warmth of that confession, Ilara's mind, sharp and honed by years of royal education, began to work. She was not a warrior, but she possessed a different kind of arsenal. She remembered her long hours in the castle library, poring over dusty scrolls not for pleasure, but to escape the pitying glances of the court. She recalled a specific document, an ancient land charter from the kingdom's founding, a document Valerus, with his arrogance and disdain for history, would have long forgotten. She asked Cale to describe the boundaries of the village lands, the placement of the oldest farms, the common grazing pastures. As he spoke, a plan, audacious and brilliant, began to form in her mind. The charter, she realized, granted freehold rights to the common lands for any family who had worked a homestead for 3 generations. Valerus's recent, crushing land taxes, the very ones crippling the village, were illegal. He was taxing men on land that, by ancient law, already belonged to them. Cale listened to her plan, his initial disbelief slowly giving way to a glimmer of hope. It was a dangerous gamble, a direct challenge to the prince's authority. But their situation was already desperate. Armed with Ilara's discovery, he cautiously approached a few of the older, more respected villagers, a blacksmith whose family had worked the same forge for a century, a farmer whose lineage was tied to the very soil. At first, they were fearful. The prince's wrath was a terrible thing. But Cale did not present the idea as his own. It was the Lady Ilara who found it, he explained. She has read the old laws. He then approached the village priest, a gentleman who cared more for his flock than for politics. The priest, a scholar in his own right, confirmed it. The charter was real, its laws still technically binding. The knowledge spread like wildfire. The villagers' fear, long simmering under the prince's tyranny, began to curdle into anger. They had been cheated. Their loyalty had been repaid with theft. An act of integrity, Ilara's intellectual gift, had begun to win the allies their isolation had cost them. The final confrontation took place, fittingly, in the same town square where Ilara had been traded away. Valerus had summoned the villagers to announce yet another tax, this one to fund a new wing for his hunting lodge. He stood on the platform, arrogant and untouchable, as Cale, with the village elders and the priest at his side, stepped forward. He held up a carefully transcribed copy of the charter. "Your Grace," Cale began, his voice steady and strong, "we cannot pay this tax." Nor can we continue to pay the land taxes you have levied. Valerus laughed, a short, ugly sound. And why is that, Woodcutter? Have you decided to starve? It was Ilara, carried to the front of the crowd in her chair by two strong farmers, who answered. They will not pay, brother, because you are attempting to steal what is already theirs. She proceeded, her voice ringing with clarity and power, to recite the relevant articles of the king's charter, her memory perfect, her logic irrefutable. She laid out the truth for all to hear, that the prince was not a strong ruler providing for his people, but a common thief enriching himself through illegal extortion. The crowd, now armed with the truth, began to murmur, their resentment finding its voice. They were not a mob, they were a united front, standing on the unassailable rock of the law. Valerus looked out at the sea of hardened faces and saw his power evaporating. It was not a battle of swords, but of wits and truth, and he had been utterly disarmed. Defeated by his own greed and arrogance, Prince Valerus was left utterly diminished. He could not fight the ancient charter without causing a full-scale revolt that would surely reach the king's ears. Forced to rescind the illegal taxes, his authority was shattered. He was now the one who was shamed, his tyranny exposed, his image of power fractured beyond repair. He retreated to his castle, a bitter, isolated man, a perfect mirror of the fate he had once designed for his sister. He was a prince of nothing but cold stone and hollow titles. Kale and Ilara were now free. The villagers, their respect won, showered them with gifts of food and firewood, offering Kale more work than he could handle. There was even talk of petitioning the king to restore Ilara's title and lands. But they refused. They had no desire to reclaim a world that had discarded them. Their new kingdom was not one of castles and courts, but one built of sturdy timber, warmed by a crackling fire. Their home, once a symbol of their downfall, had become the seat of their earned happiness, a testament to a love that had flourished in the harshest of winters. Their wealth was not in gold, but in their shared resilience and the quiet dignity they had forged together. One crisp spring morning, as sunlight streamed through the open cottage door, Ilara was teaching Lyra how to form her name on the slate. Kale stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, watching them. A smile touched his lips, a genuine smile of pure contentment that erased the last shadows of his old grief. Ilara looked up and met his gaze, her own heart swelling with a love so profound it felt like the sun itself. In that perfect, silent moment of connection, the little girl, Lyra, looked from Kale's face to Ilara's. She pointed a small finger at the two of them, then at the cottage, at the hearth, at the world they had built. A sound emerged from her lips, hesitant at first, then clearer, a single, perfect word that contained everything. Home, she said. It was the sound of a family reborn, of a wound finally and completely healed. True nobility, they had discovered, is not a birthright. It is not etched in a family crest or measured in titles. It is a quality of the spirit, a quiet strength that chooses kindness in the face of cruelty, and finds purpose in the service of others. Your worth is not defined by the judgment of the world, nor is it diminished by the flaws of the vessel that carries you. It is found in the courage to love, the resilience to endure, and the profound realization that the most magnificent kingdom you can ever build is a life shared with a soul who sees you, truly sees you, and calls you home.